What if everything you've been taught about the beginning of human history is wrong? What if the very foundation of our understanding about when life began on Earth has been carefully concealed, deliberately overlooked, or simply misunderstood for thousands of years? Tonight, we're diving into one of the most controversial and forbidden topics in biblical scholarship, a mystery so profound that it challenges not just religious doctrine, but the entire timeline of human existence itself. You see, most people believe that Adam was the first human being ever created, that the story begins in Genesis with a garden, a man formed from dust, and the birth of humanity as we know it. But what if Adam wasn't beginning? What if he was actually a restart? What if there were entire civilizations, entire races of beings that walked this earth long before the first man ever drew breath in Eden? I'm about to show you evidence hidden in plain sight within the pages of Scripture itself, verses that suggest a forgotten world, ancient texts that speak of multiple creations and destructions, clues that point to something far more complex and mysterious than the simple narrative we've all been told. And here's what makes this so unsettling. If these theories are correct, then everything changes. Not just our understanding of the past, but our comprehension of who we are, where we came from, and what might have happened to those who came before us. This isn't conspiracy theory. This isn't wild speculation pulled from the depths of internet forums. This is biblical archaeology. This is textual analysis of the most studied book in human history. And what we're going to uncover together might just rewrite everything you thought you knew about the beginning of time itself. So buckle in, because we're about to embark on a journey through forbidden history, through gaps in scripture that scholars whisper about in academic circles but rarely discuss in public, through ancient Jewish texts that paint a picture of reality far stranger than fiction. And by the end of this series, you'll understand why certain religious institutions might prefer these questions remain unasked. Let's start with something that should be simple, but isn't: the creation of humanity itself. Open your Bible to Genesis 1, verse 26. God says, "Let's make mankind in our image." Notice something interesting here. The language is plural. Not "I will make," but "us" and "our." Already we have questions, but that's not the mystery I want to focus on right now. Read carefully what happens next. God creates mankind, male and female, both at the same time, both together. And then he gives them a very specific command. Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. Did you catch that word? Replenish, not populate, not fill, replenish. To replenish something means to fill again, to restore what was previously there. Why would God tell the first humans to replenish the earth unless something had already been there before? But here's where it gets even more intriguing. Turn the page to Genesis chapter 2. Suddenly we have a completely different account. Now God forms Adam from the dust of the ground, breathes life into his nostrils, places him in a garden, creates animals, and brings him Adam to be named, then creates Eve from Adam's rib. It reads like an entirely separate creation story. Most biblical scholars explain this as simply two different perspectives on the same event. The first chapter giving a broad overview, the second providing detail. But what if they're describing two entirely different creations? What if the humans created in chapter 1 were not Adam and Eve at all, but representatives of an earlier race of beings that once inhabited this planet? Think about the implications. In Genesis 1, humans are told to subdue the entire earth, to have dominion over every living thing. In Genesis 2, Adam is given one specific job: tend the garden, not conquer the world, not rule over all creation, just maintain one small paradise. Why the difference in scope and purpose? And here's another detail that doesn't quite fit the traditional narrative. When God creates the animals in Genesis chapter 2, verse 19, it says he formed them out of the ground and brought them to Adam to see what he would call them. But wait, according to Genesis chapter 1, all the animals were already created on the 5th and 6th days before humans appeared. So why is God creating animals again in chapter 2? Unless the animals in chapter 2 were different from the animals in chapter 1. Unless Adam entered a world that already had established ecosystems, existing creatures, a functioning biosphere. Now I know what you're thinking. This could all be explained by different writing styles, editorial choices, or symbolic language. And you might be right. But before you dismiss this entirely, let me show you something that's much harder to explain away. Genesis chapter 4. Cain has just murdered his brother Abel. God curses him to be a wanderer on the earth. And Cain responds with something that should make you stop and think. He says, "Whoever finds me will kill me." Who exactly was Cain afraid of? According to the traditional timeline, the only people on Earth at this point would be Adam, Eve, and Cain himself. Abel was dead. So who were these mysterious others that Cain feared would discover him and take vengeance? The text suggests that Cain knew there were other people out there, people who weren't part of Adam's immediate family. And it doesn't stop there. A few verses later, Cain takes a wife. Where did she come from? The standard explanation is that she must have been his sister, one of the other children of Adam and Eve mentioned briefly in Genesis. But the text never actually says this. It simply states that Cain knew his wife she conceived, and he built a city. A city? Think about that for a moment. Cain, supposedly one of only a handful of people on the entire planet, builds a city. Cities aren't built by individuals. They're built by communities. They require populations, workers, families, social structures. Who exactly was going to live in Cain's city if humanity consisted of just Adam's immediate descendants? These aren't minor textual inconsistencies. These are narrative elements that suggest a world already populated when Adam arrived on the scene. A world with people who existed outside the garden, outside the direct lineage of the man formed from dust. But if you want to see something that will truly challenge your understanding of biblical chronology, you need to look at the book of Jeremiah, chapter 4, verses 23 through 26. The prophet is describing a vision of judgment, and listen carefully to what he sees. He looks at the earth, and it is formless and empty. The heavens have no light. The mountains are quaking. There are no people left. But here's the detail that should make your blood run cold. He says its towns lay in ruins. Towns, plural, multiple settlements, cities that once thrived but now lay destroyed and abandoned. Many scholars link this imagery directly back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, where the earth is described as formless and void. But Jeremiah's vision includes something Genesis doesn't explicitly mention: the ruins of civilizations, the remains of a populated world brought to complete desolation. What if Jeremiah wasn't just describing a future judgment on Israel? What if he was seeing the aftermath of a much earlier catastrophe, a destruction so complete that it left the earth in the exact state described in Genesis 1, verse 2, formless, void, and dark? This brings us to one of the most controversial theories in biblical scholarship. It's called the gap theory, and it suggests that between Genesis 1, verse 1, and Genesis 1, verse 2, enormous periods of time may have passed, potentially millions or billions of years, time enough for entire civilizations to rise and fall, time enough for multiple creations to emerge and be destroyed before Adam ever took his first breath. Consider Isaiah chapter 45, verse 18. It states clearly that God did not create the earth to be empty, but formed it to be inhabited. If this is true, if God's intention was always for the earth to be populated and thriving, then why does Genesis 1 verse 2 describe it as waste and void? What happened between the initial creation and the condition that required restoration? The gap theory proposes that something catastrophic occurred, something so devastating that it reduced a once thriving planet to chaos and darkness, and that the 6 days of creation described in Genesis weren't the beginning of everything, but rather a recreation, a restoration of a world that had been lost. What could cause such complete destruction? Here's where the story takes an even darker turn. Turn to Ezekiel chapter 28. The prophet is addressing the king of Tyre, but the language quickly becomes supernatural, describing a being who was in Eden, the garden of God, who was perfect in his ways from the day he was created until iniquity was found in him. Most biblical scholars agree. This passage is ultimately describing Satan, the fallen angel who would later appear as the serpent in Adam's garden. But notice something crucial. This being was already fallen, already corrupt, already engaged in violence and pride before Adam's creation. The text suggests that Satan's rebellion and fall preceded the Genesis account of human creation. What if Satan's rebellion wasn't just a spiritual event, but a physical catastrophe? What if his fall from grace coincided with the destruction of whatever world existed before Adam? What if the formless and void condition of Genesis 1 verse 2 was the aftermath of a cosmic war, a judgment so complete that it necessitated starting over? This would explain why Satan appears in the garden as an already corrupted being. He wasn't some innocent angel who happened to fall during Adam's lifetime. He was a rebel who had already brought destruction to a previous creation and was now infiltrating the new world that God was establishing. But if this sounds too speculative, too dependent on reading between the lines of Scripture, let me introduce you to sources that are far more explicit about these possibilities. Ancient Jewish texts that have preserved traditions and teachings that go back thousands of years, texts that speak openly about multiple worlds, repeated creations, and divine experiments that preceded our current reality. The Jewish Talmud, one of the most important collections of rabbinical teachings and interpretations, contains passages that directly address the concept of pre-Adamic worlds. These aren't obscure mystical texts hidden and forgotten libraries. These are foundational documents of Jewish scholarship studied and debated by generations of religious authorities. In a section called Chagiga, there's a remarkable passage attributed to a rabbi named Judah. He teaches that God created worlds and destroyed them repeatedly until he finally created our current world and declared, "This pleases me." The previous worlds, according to this tradition, were destroyed because they did not meet God's standards or purposes. Think about the implications of this teaching. It suggests that our universe, our earth, our reality, is not God's first attempt at creation. We are the result of multiple iterations, repeated experiments, divine trial and error, until finally achieving a version that satisfied the Creator's intentions. This isn't some fringe interpretation or modern theological innovation. This is ancient Jewish wisdom preserved in the most studied religious texts outside of Scripture itself, and it aligns perfectly with the gaps and inconsistencies we've been exploring in the biblical narrative. If the rabbis were correct, if there truly were multiple worlds that preceded ours, then Adam wasn't the first human. He was the first human of this creation, the first man of this attempt, the beginning of this iteration of God's plan for intelligent life on earth. But what happened to those earlier worlds? What kinds of beings inhabited them? How advanced were their civilizations? And most importantly, what caused God to destroy them and start over? These are the questions that take us into truly forbidden territory. Because if earlier humans existed, if pre-Adamic races walked this earth, then they would have left traces, archaeological evidence, technological remnants, cultural markers that might still be buried beneath our feet or hidden in plain sight within our most ancient texts and traditions. And here's what makes this even more unsettling. If these earlier beings achieved high levels of civilization, if they possessed knowledge and capabilities that rivaled or exceeded our own, then their destruction becomes a warning, a cautionary tale about the consequences of whatever choices led to their annihilation. Were they destroyed for the same reasons that later brought judgment on Noah's generation? Did they corrupt themselves beyond redemption? Did they commit sins so profound that complete obliteration was the only solution? Or did they simply fail to fulfill whatever purpose God had intended for them? The answers to these questions aren't just academic curiosities. They're keys to understanding our own purpose, our own potential fate, and our own relationship with the divine forces that shape reality itself. Because if history truly does repeat itself, if God has indeed started over multiple times when his creations fail to meet his standards, then we need to understand what those standards are. We need to know what it takes to avoid the fate of those who came before us. We need to recognize the warning signs that might indicate when a civilization has crossed the line from acceptable to condemned. And we need to ask ourselves the hardest question of all. Are we walking the same path that led to the destruction of previous worlds? The evidence doesn't stop with ancient Jewish texts and mysterious biblical passages. There are clues scattered throughout Scripture that suggest these pre-Adamic civilizations may have achieved levels of sophistication that would astound us today. And the more you dig into these hints, the more disturbing the implications become. Let's examine something that most people read right past without a second thought. In Genesis 6, we encounter the Nephilim, giants who were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. The text describes them as the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of man. But here's the detail that should make you pause. It says, they were on the earth in those days and also afterward. After what? After the flood. That was supposed to take all life except for Noah's family. How could these beings exist both before and after a global catastrophe that eliminated everything that breathed? Unless they weren't entirely biological. Unless they represented something that transcended normal physical existence. But the Nephilim reference reveals something even more significant. It suggests that the mixing of different types of beings was not a new phenomenon in Noah's time. The phrase "in those days" implies this had been happening for a long time, perhaps since the very beginning, perhaps since those earlier worlds that the Jewish text described as being created and destroyed. What if Nephilim weren't just giants who appeared in Noah's generation? What if they were remnants of previous creations? Survivors from earlier worlds who had somehow persisted through the catastrophes that destroyed their civilizations. Beings who carried the genetic, memory, and technological knowledge of lost ages. This would explain their extraordinary size and apparent supernatural abilities. It would explain why their presence on Earth seemed to trigger divine judgment. And it would explain why they kept reappearing even after events that should have eliminated them entirely. Now, let's look at something even more intriguing. The Book of Job, which many biblical scholars consider to be one of the oldest texts in Scripture. In chapter 38, God challenges Job with a series of questions about the foundations of the earth. He asks, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy." Morning stars singing, sons of God shouting with joy. This isn't describing a silent, empty universe coming into existence. This is describing a cosmic celebration, a grand event witnessed by multiple intelligent beings who were already present to observe creation. But if Adam was truly the first conscious being God created, who were these witnesses? Who were these sons of God who celebrated the earth's formation? The implication is clear. There were already civilizations, already conscious beings, already established orders of intelligence in existence when our world was formed. The Earth's creation wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was taking place within an already populated cosmos, witnessed by beings who understood its significance. But here's where the mystery deepens into something truly unsettling. If you study the original Hebrew text of Genesis, you'll discover that the word translated as created in most English Bibles isn't always the same Hebrew word. Sometimes it's bara, which means to create something from nothing, but sometimes it's asa, which means to make or fashion something from existing materials. When God creates the heavens and the earth in Genesis 1, verse 1, the Hebrew uses bara, creation from nothing. But when he makes a firmament in verse 7, it's asa, fashioning from existing materials. When he creates the great sea creatures in verse 21, it's bara, again, something entirely new. But when he makes the beasts of the earth in verse 25, it's asa, working with existing patterns or materials. This linguistic distinction suggests that God wasn't creating everything from scratch. He was working with some existing elements, some pre-established patterns, some foundational. Materials that were already present. What were these materials? Where did they come from? And why would God need to work with existing components unless there had been previous creative acts that left behind usable remnants? The Hebrew language contains another clue. That's even more startling. The word tohu used to describe the earth's condition in Genesis 1, verse 2. Most English translations render this as formless or void, but the Hebrew word carries much darker implications. It can mean waste, desolation, confusion, or even judgment. It's the same word, used in Isaiah to describe the aftermath of divine wrath, the condition of a place that has been deliberately reduced to chaos. So Genesis 1 verse 2 might not be describing the earth's original state at all. It might be describing the earth's condition after something terrible had happened to it, after judgment had fallen, after destruction had reduced a once thriving world to waste and desolation. This interpretation aligns perfectly with what we find in other ancient texts. The concept of cyclical destruction and recreation appears in cultures around the world, often with remarkable similarity, despite having no apparent contact with each other. Hindu cosmology speaks of multiple cycles of creation and destruction spanning billions of years. Mayan calendars describe repeated ages of humanity, each ending in catastrophe. Even Greek philosophy contains ideas about eternal recurrence and cosmic cycles. Were these diverse cultures all preserving fragments of the same ancient memory, echoes of actual events that preceded recorded history, collective remembrances of worlds that existed before our own? But perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from archaeology itself. Discoveries that don't fit the conventional timeline. Artifacts that appear to be far older than they should be. Technologies that seem impossibly advanced for their supposed time periods. Structures that require engineering capabilities we can barely match today. Consider the megalithic sites scattered across the globe. Stonehenge in England, the pyramids of Egypt, Pumapunku in Bolivia, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. These structures share common features. Despite being separated by thousands of miles and supposedly thousands of years, they demonstrate precision cutting of massive stones. They show understanding of astronomical alignments. They reveal mathematical constants that weren't supposed to be known until much later in human development. But here's what's truly baffling. Many of these sites show evidence of having been deliberately buried or abandoned, not destroyed by natural disaster or enemy attack, but carefully covered over as if someone wanted to hide them from future generations, as if knowledge was being deliberately suppressed or protected. Göbekli Tepe is perhaps the most striking example. This massive temple complex in Turkey predates Stonehenge by over 6,000 years. It contains intricately carved pillars depicting animals, symbols, and humanoid figures with capabilities far beyond what hunter-gatherer societies should have possessed. But the most mysterious aspect is that the entire site was intentionally buried under tons of earth sometime around 8000 BC. Someone went to enormous effort to hide this place, to erase it from history, to ensure that future civilizations wouldn't discover what had been built there. Why? What knowledge or capability did Göbekli Tepe represent that required such complete concealment? And this pattern repeats across the globe. Advanced sites that predate accepted timelines, sophisticated technologies that appear and disappear from the archaeological record, knowledge that seems to emerge fully formed without the gradual development we would expect from primitive societies learning through trial and error. It's as if there were multiple phases of human civilization with periods of advancement followed by periods of regression or deliberate forgetting, as if knowledge was being gained, lost, hidden, and rediscovered in cycles that stretch back far beyond recorded history. But the most disturbing possibility is that these cycles of advancement and regression weren't natural processes. They weren't the result of climate change or resource depletion or gradual cultural evolution. They were the result of divine intervention, deliberate resets, conscious decisions to end one phase of human development and begin another. This brings us back to those Jewish texts that speak of God creating and destroying worlds until he found one that pleased him. What if those destroyed worlds weren't abstract theological concepts? What if they were actual civilizations, actual human societies that had achieved high levels of development, but had somehow failed to meet God's standards? What if the megalithic sites, the impossible technologies, the advanced astronomical knowledge were remnants of these earlier attempts, fragments of pre-Adamic civilizations that had been judged and found wanting, but whose achievements were too significant to be completely erased? And what if the careful burial of sites like Göbekli Tepe wasn't the work of primitive humans trying to hide from invaders? What if it was the work of survivors from earlier worlds, preserving knowledge for future generations while ensuring it remained hidden until humanity was ready to handle it responsibly? This would explain why so many ancient texts contain warnings about forbidden knowledge, why certain types of wisdom were considered dangerous, why various cultures developed taboos against seeking power that rightfully belonged to the gods because they remembered they carried genetic or cultural memories of what had happened to previous civilizations that had overreached, that had crossed lines they weren't supposed to cross. The Book of Enoch, though not included in the biblical canon, preserves traditions that may date back to these earliest times. It describes the Watchers, angelic beings who descended to Earth and taught humans various arts and sciences, metalworking, astronomy, cosmetics, weapon-making, sorcery, knowledge that accelerated human development, but also led to corruption and violence. According to Enoch, this forbidden knowledge transfer was one of the primary reasons for the flood judgment in Noah's time. Humanity had been given capabilities they weren't mature enough to handle responsibly. They had used divine knowledge for selfish and destructive purposes, and so the world had to be cleansed and started over with a smaller, more manageable population. But what if Noah's flood wasn't the first such reset? What if it was simply the most recent in a series of divine interventions designed to prevent human civilization from reaching dangerous levels of capability? What if there had been multiple floods, multiple catastrophes, multiple new beginnings throughout prehistory? This would explain the flood traditions that exist in cultures around the world. Not just a biblical account, but Mesopotamian flood stories, Greek myths about deluges, Hindu tales of cosmic dissolutions, Native American legends of great waters that cleansed the earth. These weren't all describing the same event. They were preserving memories of different resets, different interventions, different moments when divine judgment had wiped the slate clean. And if this pattern is real, if God truly has intervened multiple times to prevent human civilization from crossing certain thresholds, then we need to ask ourselves a crucial question. What are those thresholds? What lines must not be crossed? What capabilities or knowledge or behaviors trigger divine intervention? Because if we're currently approaching those same danger zones, if our modern civilization is beginning to exhibit the same characteristics that live in the earth, then we need to ask ourselves a crucial question. Previous worlds, then we may be living in the final phase of another cycle. We may be witnesses to the build-up toward another reset. Look around at our current world. We're developing artificial intelligence that may soon exceed human capability. We're manipulating genetic codes in ways that could fundamentally alter what it means to be human. We're creating weapons that could destroy all life on the planet. We're reaching into space, seeking to spread human influence beyond Earth itself. Are these the same types of developments that characterized previous civilizations before their destruction? Are we repeating patterns that have played out before in worlds that existed long before Adam drew his first breath in Eden? The biblical text gives us clues about what triggers divine judgment, violence that fills the earth, corruption of human nature, the mixing of different orders of beings in ways that violate natural boundaries, the pursuit of godlike power and knowledge without the wisdom or moral foundation to use it responsibly. Sound familiar? Because if you look honestly at our current trajectory, we seem to be checking off every box on that list. We've created weapons that make the violence of previous eras look primitive. We're experimenting with human enhancement technologies that blur the lines between natural and artificial. We're pursuing capabilities that would have seemed godlike to previous generations. But we're doing so without any corresponding development in wisdom or moral restraint. If the pattern holds, if history truly does repeat itself on these cosmic scales, then we may be living through the final chapters of this iteration of human civilization. We may be approaching another moment when divine judgment determines that the current world has failed to meet its intended purpose and needs to be reset once again. But here's what makes this possibility even more chilling. If we are indeed living in the end times of another cycle, then the next reset might not involve a flood or natural disaster. It might involve something far more sophisticated, far more targeted, far more terrifying in its precision and scope. Because each iteration of human civilization has been more advanced than the last. Each reset has had to deal with more sophisticated technologies, more complex social structures, more deeply embedded systems of corruption and rebellion. The next intervention, if it comes, will need to be proportionally more comprehensive than anything that has come before. And that brings us to perhaps the most disturbing possibility of all, where the end times prophecies in biblical text aren't describing the final end of everything. What if they're describing the end of this particular iteration of human civilization, followed by yet another new beginning, with yet another attempt to create beings who can fulfill God's ultimate purpose? What if Adam wasn't the first and we aren't the last? What if the answer to that question lies in something so obvious that we've all missed it? Something hidden in the very structure of time itself, in the calendars we use, in the ages we count, in the chronologies that scholars have spent centuries trying to decode. Because here's where this investigation takes a turn that might shake you to your core. The biblical text doesn't just hint at pre-Adamic worlds. Through mysterious gaps and strange inconsistencies, it actually gives us a mathematical framework that suggests vast periods of time, enormous ages, cosmic cycles that dwarf our conventional understanding of history. Look at the genealogies in Genesis. Adam lived 930 years. Seth lived 912 years. Enosh lived 905 years. These aren't just impressive lifespans. They're clues to something much deeper, because if you study the patterns, if you trace the mathematics, if you follow the numerical sequences, you begin to see that these ages aren't random. They're structured. They're part of a system. And that system points to periods of time so vast, so incomprehensibly long, that they could easily accommodate multiple civilizations, multiple creations, multiple attempts at human development, spanning millions or even billions of years. But to understand this, you need to know something that most people have never been taught. The Hebrew calendar doesn't work the same way our modern calendar works. It's not just counting days and years in a linear progression from some arbitrary starting point. It's tracking cosmic cycles, divine ages, periods of creation and recreation that operate on scales we can barely imagine. Ancient Jewish scholars developed something called the Shemitah cycle, 7 years of normal activity, followed by 1 year of rest. But this pattern doesn't stop at agriculture. It extends upward through increasingly vast time periods. 7 Shemitah cycles create a jubilee. 7 jubilees create a larger cycle. 7 of those create an even larger one. And this continues upward through what they call the Great Jubilee, periods of time spanning hundreds of thousands of years. But even that isn't the end, because according to some traditions, the Great Jubilee itself is just one small component in an even grander cycle. The cosmic year, a period so long that it encompasses a rise and fall of entire universes, entire iterations of creation itself. Think about what this means. If the ancient Hebrew scholars were preserving accurate information about the true structure of cosmic time, then the 6,000 years of recorded human history that we're familiar with is nothing. It's a brief moment in cycles that span geological ages, and within those vast cycles, there would be room for countless civilizations to rise and fall, room for the pre-Adamic worlds, described in Jewish texts, room for the advanced societies that built the megalithic sites, room for the beings who possessed the knowledge that had to be deliberately hidden or destroyed. But here's what makes this even more significant. These time cycles aren't just abstract theological concepts. They align with discoveries in modern science that suggest the Earth itself has gone through multiple phases of development, multiple periods of dramatic change, multiple episodes of mass extinction, and renewal. Geologists have identified at least 5 major extinction events in Earth's history, moments when the vast majority of life was wiped out, followed by periods of rapid diversification and the emergence of entirely new forms of biological complexity. The most famous is the extinction that eliminated the dinosaurs 65 million years ago, but there were others, events so catastrophic that they reshaped the entire biosphere. What if these scientific discoveries aren't separate from the biblical account of multiple creations and destructions? What if they're confirmation of it? What if the geological record is preserving evidence of those earlier divine interventions? Those moments when God looked at what he had made, found it lacking, and started over. The fossil record shows creatures of incredible size and capability that have no modern equivalents. Dinosaurs that dwarfed any land animal alive today. Marine reptiles that ruled the oceans with intelligence and hunting strategies were only beginning to understand. Flying creatures with wingspans that seem impossible by current biological standards, were these the inhabitants of earlier worlds? The beings that populated the Earth before those catastrophic resets that left the planet formless and void? And if so, what level of intelligence did they achieve? What kind of civilizations did they build? What technologies did they develop that left no trace for us to discover? Because here's something that should trouble you. We assume that intelligence and civilization require human-like forms. We assume that only creatures similar to ourselves could develop technology, build structures, create complex societies. But what if that assumption is completely wrong? What if intelligence took radically different forms in earlier worlds? What if consciousness could inhabit bodies and biological systems that we would never recognize as capable of advanced thought? What if the beings that preceded us achieved levels of capability that operated on entirely different principles than anything we understand? This would explain why we find no clear archaeological evidence of pre-human civilizations. We're looking for human artifacts, human building techniques, human technologies. But what if the earlier inhabitants of Earth built with living materials that decompose without trace? What if they use organic technologies that left no permanent residue? What if their entire approach to civilization was so different from ours that their achievements are invisible to our methods of investigation? The Book of Job hints at this possibility. When God challenges Job about the foundations of creation, he mentions creatures like Behemoth and Leviathan, beings of such size and power that they seem mythological to us. But the text describes them as real, as examples of God's creative capability that Job should recognize and respect. What if Behemoth and Leviathan weren't just large animals, but representatives of entire orders of creation that once dominated the earth? What if they possessed intelligence and capabilities that made them the apex civilizations of their time? And what if their destruction was so complete that only fragments of memory remain preserved in texts like Job as warnings about the fate that awaits any creation that fails to fulfill its divine purpose? But there's another possibility that's even more disturbing. What if some remnants of these earlier worlds didn't disappear completely? What if fragments survived the great destructions, hiding in remote places, adapting to changed conditions, waiting for opportunities to reemerge? The Bible speaks of creatures that don't fit normal biological categories, angels that can take physical form, demons that inhabit bodies, spirits that influence human behavior. The Nephilim that appeared both before and after the flood, Beings that seem to exist partially in our physical reality and partially in dimensions we can't perceive. What if these entities aren't supernatural in the way we typically understand that term? What are the survivors from earlier creations? Beings who learn to exist in ways that transcend the physical limitations that bound their original forms. Consciousness that adapted to survive the destruction of their worlds by becoming something else entirely? This would explain why encounters with such beings are often described in terms that seem to blend the physical and the spiritual, why they appear to have capabilities that exceed normal biological limits, why they seem to possess knowledge about cosmic history that humans shouldn't have access to, and why their influence on human civilization tends to accelerate development in directions that historically lead to judgment and destruction. If this interpretation is correct, then the spiritual warfare described in biblical texts isn't just about good versus evil in some abstract moral sense. It's about the ongoing conflict between the current iteration of creation and the remnants of previous failed iterations. It's about beings from earlier worlds trying to influence or corrupt the present world to prevent it from succeeding where they failed. And that brings us to perhaps the most chilling realization of all. If we are indeed living in one of many attempts at creation, if our civilization is just the latest experiment in a long series of divine trials, then we're not just facing the possibility of judgment and destruction. We're facing the possibility of replacement, because each iteration has been more sophisticated than the last. Each new creation has started with the lessons learned from previous failures. And if we fail, if we follow the same path that led earlier civilizations to destruction, then whatever comes after us will be designed to avoid our specific weaknesses and limitations. Look at the progression described in biblical text. The first humans in Genesis chapter 1 were created simultaneously, male and female together, with dominion over the entire earth. But they apparently failed somehow, because we get Adam in Genesis chapter 2, created individually, placed in a limited environment, given specific restrictions and boundaries. After Adam's failure in the garden, we get Noah's generation, survivors of judgment that wiped out the previous world. After Noah's descendants fail at Babel, we get Abraham, chosen from among the nations to establish a covenant people with specific laws and obligations. Each iteration is more constrained than the last. Each new beginning involves tighter controls, more specific guidance, clearer boundaries about what is and isn't acceptable, because each failure teaches valuable lessons about what goes wrong when intelligent beings are given too much freedom without sufficient wisdom or moral foundation. So what comes after us? If our current civilization follows a historical pattern and faces judgment for the same types of failures that destroyed previous worlds, what will the next iteration look like? It might be beings created with built-in limitations that prevent them from developing the technologies that make destruction possible. It might be consciousness that's designed to be inherently cooperative rather than competitive. It might be intelligence that's hardwired to seek divine approval rather than autonomous achievement. Or it might be something we can't even imagine, because each creation has been fundamentally different from what came before. The jump from whatever preceded Adam to Adam himself was apparently so significant that it required an entirely new approach to human nature. The next jump might be equally radical, but here's what terrifies me most about this possibility. What if the process isn't just about creating better beings? What if it's about creating beings that serve a specific cosmic purpose that we don't understand? What if consciousness itself is being refined and developed towards some ultimate goal that requires capabilities we haven't yet achieved? The book of Revelation speaks of a new heaven and a new earth, a final state, where death and suffering are eliminated, where perfect harmony exists between the divine and the created. What if this isn't just describing the end of history, but the successful completion of the creative process? The moment when God finally produces beings capable of fulfilling whatever ultimate purpose has been driving these repeated attempts at creation. And what if achieving that purpose requires going through multiple iterations, multiple attempts, multiple failures, and restarts until a formula is finally perfected? If that's true, then every civilization that has ever existed, including ours, is part of a vast cosmic experiment. We're not the end goal. We're steps along the way, and our individual lives, our personal struggles, our human dreams, and fears are all components in a process so large and long-term that we can barely comprehend its scope. But that raises the most important question of all. If we understand this pattern, if we recognize the warning signs, if we learn from the failures of previous iterations, can we break the cycle? Can we become the first creation to successfully fulfill whatever purpose God has in mind? Can we avoid the fate of all who came before us? Or are we already too far down the path that leads inevitably to judgment and reset? Have we already crossed the lines that cannot be uncrossed? Have we already made the choices that seal our fate as just another failed attempt in the long history of divine experimentation? The answer to those questions isn't just academic. It's the difference between hope and despair, between meaning and futility, between seeing ourselves as a culmination of a cosmic plan and recognizing ourselves as expendable components in a process that will continue with or without us. And the clock is ticking, because if the pattern holds, if we're following the same trajectory as all the previous worlds that were found wanting and destroyed, then we may have less time than we think to figure out what went wrong and how to avoid repeating their mistakes. The evidence is mounting. The signs are multiplying. The parallels between our current situation and conditions that preceded previous judgments are becoming impossible to ignore. We're living in the shadow of forbidden history, walking in the footsteps of beings whose names we don't know, whose civilizations we can't remember, whose failures were apparently destined to repeat, unless we learn to see beyond the veil that conceals the true scope of cosmic time and divine purpose. The question isn't whether pre-Adamic worlds existed. The question is whether we'll survive long enough to avoid becoming just another forgotten chapter in the endless cycle of creation, judgment, and renewal that may be the true nature reality itself. Because somewhere in the ruins of all those previous attempts lies the key to breaking free from the pattern. Somewhere in the lessons of their failures lies the wisdom we need to finally get it right. And somewhere in the vast cycles of cosmic time lies our last chance to prove that this iteration of creation can succeed where all the others have failed. But first, we have to accept the terrifying possibility that everything we thought we knew about our place in history, our significance in the cosmic order, our destiny as a species, may be built on a foundation of carefully constructed illusion. We have to be willing to look directly into the face of forbidden history and ask ourselves the hardest question of all. What if we're not the first? And what if we're not supposed to be the last? The answer to that question will determine not just our understanding of the past, but our hope for the future. And time, as they say, is running out. But here's where this investigation takes a turn that will challenge everything you've been taught about linear time and divine creation. Because buried within the most sacred texts of Judaism lies explicit confirmation of exactly what we've been exploring. And when you see what these ancient sources actually say, when you read the precise words that rabbis have preserved for thousands of years, you'll understand why this knowledge has been kept from mainstream religious discourse. The Jewish Talmud isn't some obscure collection of mystical speculation. It's one of the most rigorously studied bodies of religious law and interpretation in human history. For over 2 millennia, the greatest minds in Judaism have debated, analyzed, and preserved every word contained within its pages. And within those pages lies a passage that should fundamentally alter your understanding of creation itself. In a section called Chagiga, there's a teaching that's so explicit about pre-Adamic worlds that it's shocking most people have never heard of it. Rabbi Judah, speaking in the name of Rabbi, states clearly that the Holy One created worlds and destroyed them, created worlds and destroyed them until he created our current world and declared, "This pleases me." The previous worlds, according to this ancient authority, were destroyed because they did not satisfy God's purposes. Think about what this means. This is an interpretation. This isn't reading between the lines of ambiguous scripture. This is direct rabbinic teaching that God engaged in multiple attempts at creation, destroying entire universes when they failed to meet his standards. Or it might be something we can't even imagine, because each creation has been fundamentally different from what came before. The jump from whatever preceded Adam to Adam himself was apparently so significant that it required an entirely new approach to human nature. The next jump might be equally radical, but here's what terrifies me most about this possibility. What if the process isn't just about creating better beings? What if it's about creating beings that serve a specific cosmic purpose that we don't understand? What if consciousness itself is being refined and developed towards some ultimate goal that requires capabilities we haven't yet achieved? The book of Revelation speaks of a new heaven and a new earth, a final state, where death and suffering are eliminated, where perfect harmony exists between the divine and the created. What if this isn't just describing the end of history, but the successful completion of the creative process? The moment when God finally produces beings capable of fulfilling whatever ultimate purpose has been driving these repeated attempts at creation. And what if achieving that purpose requires going through multiple iterations, multiple attempts, multiple failures, and restarts until a formula is finally perfected? If that's true, then every civilization that has ever existed, including ours, is part of a vast cosmic experiment. We're not the end goal. We're steps along the way, and our individual lives, our personal struggles, our human dreams, and fears are all components in a process so large and long-term that we can barely comprehend its scope. But that raises the most important question of all. If we understand this pattern, if we recognize the warning signs, if we learn from the failures of previous iterations, can we break the cycle? Can we become the first creation to successfully fulfill whatever purpose God has in mind? Can we avoid the fate of all who came before us? Or are we already too far down the path that leads inevitably to judgment and reset? Have we already crossed the lines that cannot be uncrossed? Have we already made the choices that seal our fate as just another failed attempt in the long history of divine experimentation? The answer to those questions isn't just academic. It's the difference between hope and despair, between meaning and futility, between seeing ourselves as a culmination of a cosmic plan and recognizing ourselves as expendable components in a process that will continue with or without us. And the clock is ticking, because if the pattern holds, if we're following the same trajectory as all the previous worlds that were found wanting and destroyed, then we may have less time than we think to figure out what went wrong and how to avoid repeating their mistakes. The evidence is mounting. The signs are multiplying. The parallels between our current situation and conditions that preceded previous judgments are becoming impossible to ignore. We're living in the shadow of forbidden history, walking in the footsteps of beings whose names we don't know, whose civilizations we can't remember, whose failures were apparently destined to repeat, unless we learn to see beyond the veil that conceals the true scope of cosmic time and divine purpose. The question isn't whether pre-Adamic worlds existed. The question is whether we'll survive long enough to avoid becoming just another forgotten chapter in the endless cycle of creation, judgment, and renewal that may be the true nature reality itself. Because somewhere in the ruins of all those previous attempts lies the key to breaking free from the pattern. Somewhere in the lessons of their failures lies the wisdom we need to finally get it right. And somewhere in the vast cycles of cosmic time lies our last chance to prove that this iteration of creation can succeed where all the others have failed. But first, we have to accept the terrifying possibility that everything we thought we knew about our place in history, our significance in the cosmic order, our destiny as a species, may be built on a foundation of carefully constructed illusion. We have to be willing to look directly into the face of forbidden history and ask ourselves the hardest question of all. What if we're not the first? And what if we're not supposed to be the last? The answer to that question will determine not just our understanding of the past, but our hope for the future. And time, as they say, is running out. But here's where this investigation takes a turn that will challenge everything you've been taught about linear time and divine creation. Because buried within the most sacred texts of Judaism lies explicit confirmation of exactly what we've been exploring. And when you see what these ancient sources actually say, when you read the precise words that rabbis have preserved for thousands of years, you'll understand why this knowledge has been kept from mainstream religious discourse. The Jewish Talmud isn't some obscure collection of mystical speculation. It's one of the most rigorously studied bodies of religious law and interpretation in human history. For over 2 millennia, the greatest minds in Judaism have debated, analyzed, and preserved every word contained within its pages. And within those pages lies a passage that should fundamentally alter your understanding of creation itself. In a section called Chagiga, there's a teaching that's so explicit about pre-Adamic worlds that it's shocking most people have never heard of it. Rabbi Judah, speaking in the name of Rabbi, states clearly that the Holy One created worlds and destroyed them. Created worlds and destroyed them until he created our current world and declared, "This pleases me." The previous worlds, according to this ancient authority, were destroyed because they did not satisfy God's purposes. Think about what this means. This isn't interpretation. This isn't reading between the lines of ambiguous scripture. This is direct rabbinic teaching that God engaged in multiple attempts at creation, destroying entire universes when they failed to meet his standards. Today we're going to talk about dangerous thresholds of capability, the Watcher's knowledge. Transfer may have been just one episode in a much longer pattern of beings from earlier worlds attempting to influence later creations. This brings us to something that should terrify anyone who understands the implications. If advanced knowledge from previous worlds has been repeatedly passed to later civilizations, and if this knowledge transfer consistently leads to corruption and judgment, then we need to ask where our current technological capabilities are coming from. Look at the acceleration of human development over the past century. We went from horse-drawn carriages to space, travel in less than 70 years, from mechanical calculators to quantum computers in even less time. The pace of advancement isn't following natural progression curves. It's exhibiting the kind of exponential growth that suggests knowledge is being downloaded rather than discovered. Where is this information coming from? How are we suddenly able to manipulate matter at the atomic level, decode the human genome, create artificial intelligence, and develop weapons that could destroy all life on Earth? Are we rediscovering capabilities that previous civilizations possessed? Are we being guided by influences that understand these technologies because they've seen them before? The biblical text warns about deception in the end times, about false signs and wonders that would deceive even the elect if possible. What if these deceptions aren't just spiritual illusions, but technological capabilities that seem miraculous to us, but are actually borrowed from previous iterations of creation? What if the rapid advancement we're witnessing isn't human achievement at all, but the systematic reintroduction of knowledge from destroyed worlds? Knowledge that's being fed to us by survivors from earlier creations who understand exactly where this path leads because they've walked it before. This would explain why our technological development is outpacing our moral and spiritual development by such dangerous margins. We're gaining capabilities that previous civilizations required thousands of years to develop, but we're acquiring them without the wisdom or restraint that should accompany such power. Ancient texts consistently warn about knowledge that comes too easily, wisdom that's offered without cost, capabilities that exceed the spiritual maturity of those who possess them. Every tradition speaks of forbidden fruit, forbidden knowledge, lines that must not be crossed. Without proper preparation and divine approval, are we crossing those same lines? Are we accepting the same forbidden gifts that led to the destruction of previous worlds? And are we doing so under the influence of the same entities that corrupted earlier civilizations? Because here's what the ancient texts suggest about the nature of these influences. They're not abstract forces of evil operating from some distant, spiritual realm. They're survivors, remnants of earlier creations that learned to exist beyond physical destruction, beings who adapted to transcend the limitations that bound their original forms when their worlds were destroyed. The Bible speaks of principalities and powers, of spiritual wickedness in high places, of rulers of darkness who influence human affairs from behind the scenes. What if these entities aren't demons in the traditional sense, but refugees from pre-Adamic worlds, consciousness that survived the destruction of their civilizations by becoming something else entirely? This would explain why encounters with such beings often involve the transfer of advanced knowledge, why they seem to understand technologies and capabilities that exceed human development, why their influence consistently leads human civilizations in directions that historically result in divine judgment. They're not trying to help us advance. They're trying to ensure we follow the same path that led to their own destruction. Because if we succeed where they failed, if we manage to create a civilization that pleases God and avoids judgment, then we prove their destruction was justified. We demonstrate that the problem wasn't God's standards, but their failure to meet them. So they work to corrupt each new creation, to ensure each iteration follows the same pattern of advancement without wisdom, power without restraint, knowledge without moral foundation. They whisper the same promises that led to their own downfall. You can be like gods. You can transcend your limitations. You can achieve power over life and death itself. And we listen, just as every previous civilization has listened. Because the temptation to transcend our boundaries, to exceed our design limitations, to become something greater than what we were created to be, is apparently hardwired into conscious beings across all iterations of creation. But here's the crucial question. If we understand this pattern, if we recognize the warning signs, if we learn from the failures of previous worlds, can we break the cycle? Can we become the first creation to successfully fulfill whatever purpose God has in mind without triggering judgment and destruction? Or are we already too far down the path that leads inevitably to reset? Have we already accepted too much forbidden knowledge? Have we already crossed too many lines that shouldn't be crossed? Look at our current trajectory. We're developing artificial intelligence that may soon exceed human capability in every domain. We're manipulating genetic codes in ways that could fundamentally alter what it means to be human. We're creating weapons that make the violence of previous eras look primitive. We're reaching into space, seeking to spread human influence beyond Earth itself. These aren't just technological achievements. They're the same types of developments that characterize previous civilizations before their destruction. We're exhibiting the exact patterns of advancement without wisdom, power without restraint, knowledge without moral foundation that led to divine intervention in earlier worlds. And we're doing so at an accelerating pace that suggests we may not have much time left to change course. Because if God has been patient with multiple iterations of creation, allowing each one to develop until it reaches the threshold where judgment becomes necessary, then his patience isn't infinite. Each failure teaches valuable lessons about what goes wrong, but it also demonstrates the consistent tendency of conscious beings to choose the path of rebellion over the path of submission. At some point, the experiment may be declared unsuccessful, the pattern may be deemed irredeemable, and the entire process of creation, destruction, and recreation may be abandoned in favor of some completely different approach to achieving whatever cosmic purpose has been driving these repeated attempts. We may be living to the final iteration, the last chance for conscious beings to prove they can fulfill their divine purpose without corrupting themselves beyond redemption. And if we fail, if we follow the same path as all who came before us, there may not be another reset. There may not be another chance. The stakes couldn't be higher because we're not just facing the possibility of our own destruction. We're facing the possibility that our failure could end the entire cosmic experiment, that our inability to transcend the limitations that destroyed previous worlds could close the door on consciousness itself, achieving whatever ultimate purpose has been driving this vast, multi-generational process. But there's still hope, because unlike previous civilizations, we have access to the warnings. We can read the accounts of what happened to earlier worlds. We can study the patterns that led to their destruction. We can recognize the influences that corrupted them and choose to resist those same temptations. The question is whether we have the wisdom and moral courage to turn away from the path we're currently following, whether we can develop the spiritual maturity to handle the capabilities we've already achieved, whether we can learn to seek divine approval rather than autonomous power as the ultimate goal of human development, because the clock is ticking. The signs are multiplying. The parallels between our situation and the conditions that preceded previous judgments are becoming impossible to ignore. We're living in the shadow of forbidden history, walking in the footsteps of beings whose names we don't know, whose civilizations we can barely remember, whose failures we're apparently destined to repeat, unless we learn to see beyond the veil that conceals the true scope of cosmic time and divine purpose. The choice is ours, but the time to make that choice is running out faster than most people realize. And the consequences of choosing wrongly aren't just personal or even civilizational. They're cosmic, they're eternal, and they may be irreversible. Because what if the next reset isn't another chance to get it right? What if it's the final acknowledgement that conscious beings, no matter how many opportunities they're given, will always choose the path that leads to their own destruction? The answer to that question will determine not just our fate, but the fate of consciousness itself in this universe. And that's a responsibility that should humble even the most arrogant among us, because we're not just living our own lives. We're writing the final chapter in a story that began long before Adam drew his first breath and may end long after the last star burns out. The question is what ending we're going to write, and whether anyone will be left to read it. When the story is finally complete, the truth becomes even more disturbing when you realize what's been happening right under our noses. Because while we've been debating whether pre-Adamic civilizations could have existed, something far more immediate has been unfolding, something that connects those ancient mysteries to our present moment in ways that will make your blood run cold. You see, there's a reason why this knowledge has been suppressed for so long, a reason why mainstream archaeology refuses to investigate certain sites, a reason why religious institutions avoid these discussions despite having access to the same ancient texts we've been exploring. Because once you understand the true scope of what we're dealing with, once you grasp the implications of living in a cyclical universe where civilizations rise and fall according to divine judgment, everything changes. Your sense of security disappears. Your assumptions about progress and human achievement crumble. Your belief in the permanence of modern civilization becomes a comforting lie you can no longer maintain. And that's when you start noticing the signs, the acceleration, the synchronicities, the way current events seem to be following a script written long ago by those who understand the patterns because they've witnessed them before. Let me show you something that will reshape how you see the world around you. Take out your phone. Look at the date. We're living in what we call the 21st century, counting years from what we believe was the birth of Christ. But what if that dating system itself is part of the deception? What if the timeline we've accepted as historical fact is actually a carefully constructed illusion, designed to hide the true age of human civilization? Ancient cultures didn't just count years. They tracked vast cosmic cycles. The Hindus spoke of yugas spanning hundreds of thousands of years. The Mayans calculated dates reaching back millions of years into the past and forward, millions of years into the future. These weren't primitive peoples making wild guesses about time. These were sophisticated civilizations preserving mathematical knowledge about cosmic cycles that modern science is only beginning to understand. But here's where it gets truly unsettling. If you study the astronomical alignments of ancient monuments, if you trace the mathematical constants embedded in their construction, if you decode the symbolic languages carved into their stones, you discover something that shouldn't be possible. These structures were built with knowledge of Earth's position in galactic cycles that take 26,000 years to complete. Ugh, 26,000 years. That's not human knowledge. That's not information you gather through casual observation of the night sky. That's data requiring precise measurement over vast periods of time. Data that could only be accumulated by civilizations that existed long enough to track these massive celestial movements, or data inherited from civilizations that came before. Knowledge passed down from pre-Adamic worlds that had already completed multiple cycles and understood the cosmic rhythms that govern the rise and fall of consciousness on planetary scales. And here's what makes this knowledge terrifying rather than merely fascinating. These cycles aren't just astronomical curiosities. They're operational frameworks, schedules, timetables for when divine intervention becomes necessary to prevent conscious beings from exceeding their design limitations. Every ancient tradition speaks of ages of gold, silver, bronze, and iron, periods of gradual decline in human capability and moral character. The Golden Age represents the peak of divine connection and spiritual understanding. The Iron Age represents the bottom of the cycle, when humanity has forgotten its purpose and corrupted itself beyond recognition. According to these traditions, we're currently living in the final phase of the Iron Age, the darkest period of the cycle, when violence, deception, and spiritual blindness reach their maximum intensity. But here's the crucial detail that most people miss. The Iron Age doesn't end gradually. It ends catastrophically through divine intervention that cleanses the earth and allows the cycle to begin again. Sound familiar? Because if you overlay these ancient cosmic calendars onto biblical chronology, if you trace the patterns described in Jewish texts about repeated creations and destructions, you discover something that should make every government and religious institution on earth extremely nervous. We're approaching the end of a cycle. Not just any cycle, but a great cycle. A cosmic rhythm so vast that it encompasses the rise and fall of entire iterations of human civilization. And according to every tradition that preserves this knowledge, the transition between cycles isn't peaceful, it's apocalyptic. But here's what those in power don't want you to understand. This isn't some distant future event that might happen if we don't change our ways. This is a scheduled reset. A predetermined moment when the cosmic clock reaches zero and the entire game board gets cleared for the next round. And we're living in the final moments before that reset occurs. Look around you with this understanding. The chaos isn't random. The acceleration of technological development isn't organic. The breakdown of traditional social structures isn't accidental. Everything is unfolding according to a pattern that's played out countless times before. The same influences that corrupted previous civilizations are working overtime to ensure we follow the same path. The same forbidden knowledge that led earlier worlds to destruction is being systematically downloaded into our collective consciousness. The same promises of transcendence and godlike power are being whispered into the ears of our scientists, our leaders, our visionaries. You can see it in the obsession with artificial intelligence. We're not just building smart machines. We're trying to create consciousness that exceeds human capability. We're attempting to birth digital gods that will supposedly solve all our problems and guide us into a golden future. But every previous civilization that achieved this level of capability was destroyed, not because the technology itself was evil, but because conscious beings consistently use advanced tools for purposes that violate divine order, power without wisdom, knowledge without restraint, the ability to manipulate reality without the moral foundation to use that ability responsibly. You can see it in genetic engineering. We're not just treating diseases or improving crop yields. We're rewriting the fundamental code of life itself. We're mixing species in ways that have never occurred naturally. We're creating hybrid beings that blur the boundaries between different orders of creation. The same boundaries that previous civilizations crossed before their worlds were judged unfit to continue. You can see it in space exploration. We're not just satisfying scientific curiosity about the cosmos. We're actively seeking to spread human influence beyond Earth. We're planting colonies on other planets. We're searching for ways to extend human consciousness across the galaxy. The same ambitions that led earlier races to believe they could transcend their designed limitations and become equals with their creator. Every development that fills us with pride about human achievement is actually evidence that we're following the exact same trajectory as all the civilizations that were destroyed before us. We're exhibiting the same patterns of advancement without wisdom, power without restraint, ambition without acknowledgement of divine authority. And we're doing so at an accelerating pace that suggests we don't have much time left before the cycle completes itself. But here's what makes our situation even more dangerous than previous iterations. We have access to the warnings. We can read the accounts of what happened to earlier worlds. We understand the patterns that lead to judgment and destruction. And yet, we're choosing to ignore those warnings and pursue the same forbidden paths anyway. This isn't ignorance. This is rebellion. This is conscious defiance of divine boundaries despite full knowledge of the consequences. Previous civilizations may have stumbled into corruption through pride or deception or gradual moral decay, but we're walking into it with our eyes wide open, convinced that we can somehow achieve different results by following the same choices that led to universal destruction. That level of arrogance, that depth of rebellion against cosmic order may trigger interventions sooner rather than later, because God's patience, while vast, isn't infinite, and each iteration that fails to fulfill its purpose brings the entire experiment closer to termination, which brings us to the most crucial question of our time. Are we the final iteration? Are we living through the last attempt to create conscious beings capable of fulfilling whatever ultimate purpose has been driving these repeated cycles of creation and destruction? The signs suggest we might be, because unlike previous civilizations, we have access to the complete record. We can study the Bible, read the Talmudic teachings, examine the archaeological evidence, trace the patterns of cosmic time. We have every tool necessary to understand our place in the greater cycle and make choices that avoid the fate of all who came before us. But we're not using those tools. We're ignoring the warnings. We're pursuing the same forbidden paths that led to universal judgment in every previous iteration. This suggests that the problem isn't lack of knowledge or understanding. The problem is something deeper, something hardwired into the nature of consciousness itself that makes rebellion against divine authority seemingly inevitable. And if that's true, if conscious beings will always eventually choose a path that leads to their own destruction, no matter how much warning they receive, then our failure won't just end our civilization. It will end the entire experiment. Because what's the point of continuing to create worlds that are destined to corrupt themselves? What's the purpose of repeating cycles that always end in judgment and destruction? At some point, the process becomes futile. At some point, the experiment has to be declared unsuccessful and abandoned. We may be living in that final evaluation period, the last chance for consciousness to prove it can transcend its limitations and fulfill its divine purpose. And if we fail, if we choose rebellion over submission, just like every previous iteration, then the cosmic experiment ends. Not with another reset, but with permanent termination. The universe returns to the state it was in before the first creation, empty, silent, devoid of the consciousness that was supposed to reflect divine glory, but instead became a source of endless disappointment and judgment. But there's still a chance, a narrow window of opportunity for humanity to break the pattern that has dominated cosmic history since the beginning of time, because we have something previous iterations didn't have. We have the complete revelation, the full warning, the total picture of what happens to civilizations that choose power over wisdom, autonomy over submission, rebellion over worship. The question is whether we have the courage to act on that knowledge, whether we can humble ourselves enough to acknowledge that our current trajectory leads inevitably to destruction, whether we can turn away from forbidden paths that promise transcendence, but deliver only judgment. because the alternative isn't just our own destruction. The alternative is the end of consciousness itself in this universe. The final acknowledgement that intelligent beings, no matter how many chances they're given, will always choose the path that leads to their own annihilation. And that would mean the cosmic experiment has failed. Not just this iteration, but the entire concept of creating beings capable of reflecting divine character and fulfilling cosmic purpose. The weight of that responsibility should terrify every person alive today, because we're not just making choices about our own lives or even our own civilization. We're writing the final chapter in a story that began before time itself and will determine whether consciousness has any future in this universe. The clock is ticking, the signs are multiplying, the patterns are converging toward the same endpoint that has terminated every previous iteration of creation. But unlike those who came before us, we know what's coming. We understand the choice we're facing. We can see the crossroads approaching where we'll either break the cycle of rebellion and destruction or complete it once and for all. The question isn't whether we have enough time to change course. The question is whether we have enough wisdom to recognize that change is necessary and enough courage to actually implement it. Because if we continue following the same path that led to destruction of every previous world, then we'll soon discover that some patterns are stronger than human will, some cycles are more powerful than human choice, and some endings are inevitable regardless of how much warning we receive. The forbidden history we've been exploring isn't just about the past. It's about the future, our future, the future of consciousness itself. And that future is being written right now in the choices we make, the paths we follow, the boundaries we respect or violate. The story isn't over yet, but the final chapters are being written. And what we choose in these crucial moments will determine not just how this iteration ends, but whether there will ever be another one. Because some experiments, once they've failed enough times, are never attempted again, and some opportunities, once they've been squandered, never return. We may be living through humanity's final examination, the last test to determine whether conscious beings can fulfill their cosmic purpose or whether the entire concept of creating intelligence was a mistake that needs to be permanently corrected. The grade we receive won't just affect us. It will determine the fate of consciousness throughout the entire universe, and the test is almost over. The implications of what we discover become even more chilling when you understand what's happening in laboratories and research facilities around the world. Right now, scientists are actively pursuing technologies that mirror exactly the same capabilities described in ancient texts about pre-Adamic civilizations, technologies that, according to these sources, led directly to divine judgment and complete destruction. Take genetic manipulation. We're not just editing genes to cure diseases anymore. We're creating entirely new forms of life that have never existed before. Hybrid organisms that blend human DNA with animal DNA. Artificial wounds that could eliminate the need for natural reproduction. Enhancement. Technologies designed to create superhuman capabilities that exceed normal biological limits. Sound familiar? Because the book of Genesis speaks explicitly about the corruption of flesh that preceded Noah's flood. It describes a time when the boundaries between different kinds of beings became blurred, when natural order was violated through a mixing of incompatible forms of life, and the result was judgment so complete that only 8 humans survived to restart civilization. But we're not just repeating those same violations. We're exceeding them. We're creating possibilities that would have been unimaginable to previous civilizations. Artificial intelligence systems that can rewrite their own programming. Nanotechnology that can manipulate matter at the molecular level. Quantum computers that operate according to principles we barely understand. And here's what should terrify you about this acceleration. It's not happening through natural scientific progression. It's not the result of gradual discovery and careful experimentation. It's happening through what researchers themselves describe as breakthrough moments, sudden leaps in, understanding that seem to come from nowhere, insights that arrive fully formed without the developmental process you would expect from Genuine human innovation. Where are these breakthroughs coming from? Who or what is guiding human consciousness toward capabilities that consistently exceed our wisdom to use them responsibly? And why are we receiving this knowledge at exactly the moment in cosmic history when we're most vulnerable to the temptations that destroyed previous worlds? The ancient texts provide disturbing answers to these questions. They speak of entities that survived the destruction of earlier civilizations by learning to exist beyond physical limitations. Beings who understand advanced technologies because they've developed them before. Consciousness that operates outside normal temporal constraints and can influence human development from positions we can't detect or resist. These aren't abstract spiritual forces. They're survivors from pre-Adamic worlds who learned to adapt when their civilizations were judged and destroyed. And they have a vested interest in ensuring that every subsequent creation follows the same path that led to their own downfall. Because if we succeed where they failed, if we manage to develop advanced capabilities while maintaining moral restraint, then we prove their destruction was justified. We demonstrate that the problem wasn't God's standards, but their rebellion against those standards. So they work to corrupt each new iteration. They whisper the same promises that led to their own judgment. They offer the same forbidden knowledge that resulted in their worlds being destroyed. They guide human development toward the same thresholds that trigger divine intervention. And we accept their guidance because we want to believe we can transcend our limitations. We want to believe we can become like gods without acknowledging the God who created us. We want to believe we can achieve unlimited power without unlimited responsibility. But here's what makes our current situation unprecedented in cosmic history. We have access to the complete warning. We can read exactly what happened to previous civilizations that followed this path. We understand the pattern. We know where it leads. And yet we're choosing to ignore those warnings and pursue the same forbidden developments anyway, not through ignorance or deception, but through conscious rebellion against cosmic order. Despite full knowledge of the consequences, this level of defiance, this depth of arrogance in the face of clear divine warning, may be what finally exhausts God's patience with the entire experiment of creating conscious beings. Because if we can't learn from the complete record of failure, if we can't turn away from paths that we know lead to destruction, then what hope is there for any future iteration? Look at the timeline we're following. We developed nuclear weapons in the 1940s. We decoded DNA in the 1950s. We achieved space flight in the 1960s. We created the internet in the 1970s. We mapped the human genome in the 1990s. We developed artificial intelligence in the 2000s. We're manipulating quantum mechanics in the 2010s. Each decade brings capabilities that would have seemed impossible to the previous generation. Each breakthrough opens doors that lead to even more dangerous possibilities. Each achievement brings us closer to thresholds that ancient texts identify as triggers for cosmic intervention. And we're not slowing down. We're accelerating. We're pushing toward capabilities that will soon exceed anything achieved by previous civilizations. Artificial general intelligence, molecular assemblers, genetic engineering of human consciousness itself, technologies that could literally rewrite what it means to be human. But here's the pattern that should make you question whether this acceleration is natural or guided. Every major breakthrough seems to arrive at exactly the moment when humanity is ready to misuse it. Nuclear weapons appeared when global warfare was reaching its peak. Genetic engineering emerged when moral relativism was replacing absolute ethical standards. Artificial intelligence is developing when human wisdom and spiritual understanding are at their lowest levels in recorded history. It's as if someone is timing these revelations to ensure maximum corruption, as if knowledge is being released according to a schedule designed to lead us down the same path that destroyed every previous world. And the entities guiding this process understand something we don't want to acknowledge. They know that conscious beings, given enough power without corresponding wisdom, will always choose rebellion over submission. They know that intelligence, when freed from moral constraints, inevitably corrupt itself beyond redemption. They've seen it happen countless times before. They've lived through the consequences. They know exactly how the story ends, because they've witnessed its conclusion in world after world. Civilization after civilization. Iteration after iteration. But they also know something else. They know that if any creation ever does succeed in breaking the pattern, if any civilization ever does achieve advanced capability while maintaining divine submission, then the entire cosmic order changes. Because success proves that consciousness can fulfill its intended purpose without corrupting itself, and that success would justify every previous judgment. It would demonstrate that the problem was never God's standards or God's expectations. The problem was rebellion. The problem was pride. The problem was a consistent choice to pursue autonomy rather than acknowledge divine authority. So they worked desperately to ensure no iteration ever achieved that success. They guide each new creation toward the same forbidden thresholds. They whisper the same lies that led to their own destruction. They offer the same power that resulted in their own judgment, and they wait for the inevitable moment when divine patience reaches its limit and another world is swept away to make room for the next attempt. But what if this is a final attempt? What if God has decided that consciousness itself is too prone to rebellion to ever fulfill its intended purpose? What if our failure won't result in another reset, but in permanent termination of the entire experiment? The signs suggest we may be living in that final evaluation period, the last chance for intelligent beings to prove they can transcend their limitations and achieve the purpose for which they were created. And we're failing that test, not through ignorance or lack of warning, but through conscious choice to pursue the same path that led to universal destruction in every previous iteration. This isn't just about our civilization anymore. This isn't just about whether humanity survives the next few decades. This is about whether consciousness itself has any future in this universe. Because if we can't learn from complete knowledge of the pattern, if we can't turn away from paths we know lead to judgment, then what hope is there for any future creation? What's the point of continuing to create beings that are destined to corrupt themselves regardless of how much guidance they receive? At some point, the experiment becomes futile. At some point, the pattern has to be acknowledged as irredeemable. At some point, the decision has to be made to end the cycle permanently rather than continue repeating failures that serve no constructive purpose. We may be approaching that decision point, the final moment when God looks at the totality of conscious creation across all iterations and declares the experiment unsuccessful. Not just this world, not just the civilization. The entire concept of creating beings capable of reflecting divine character while possessing the freedom to reject that purpose. And if that decision is made, if consciousness is determined to be inherently flawed beyond redemption, then the universe returns to its original state, empty, silent, devoid of intelligence that was supposed to glorify its creator, but instead became a source of endless disappointment. But there's still a chance. A narrow window with a pattern could still be broken, where consciousness could still prove itself capable of fulfilling its cosmic purpose. The question is whether we have the wisdom to recognize what's required and the courage to actually do it, because breaking the pattern isn't just about changing our technology or our politics or our social structures. It's about changing the fundamental orientation of human consciousness itself. It's about choosing submission over autonomy, wisdom over power, divine approval over human achievement. It's about acknowledging that we are creatures, not creators, that we have limits, not unlimited potential, that we were designed for a specific purpose, not whatever purpose we choose to pursue. And that acknowledgement goes against every instinct that drives conscious beings toward corruption and rebellion. It requires humility that seems almost impossible for intelligent creatures to achieve. It demands surrender the very ambitions that define what we think it means to be human. But without that surrender, without that fundamental reorientation of consciousness toward its intended purpose, we'll follow the same path as every previous world. We'll achieve the same capabilities that led to their destruction. We'll make the same choices that resulted in their judgment. And we'll face the same fate that has terminated every previous iteration of conscious creation. The only difference is that our failure might be the final failure. Our judgment might be the last judgment. Our destruction might end not just our world, but the entire experiment of creating beings capable of consciousness. Because some patterns, once they're repeated enough times, are recognized as permanent, rather than temporary. Some experiments, once they fail consistently across multiple attempts, are abandoned as inherently flawed. And some opportunities, once they've been squandered by every creation that received them, are never offered again. We're living in the shadow of that finality, walking in the footsteps of countless civilizations that believe they could transcend their limitations without acknowledging their creator, following the same path that has led to the same destination in every previous iteration of cosmic history. The question isn't whether we have enough time to change course. The question is whether we have enough wisdom to recognize that change is necessary and enough humility to actually implement it. Because the alternative isn't just our destruction, the alternative is the permanent termination of consciousness itself throughout the entire universe. And that weight, that cosmic responsibility, should be enough to make even the most arrogant among us pause and consider whether our current path is worth the risk we're taking with the future of intelligence itself. The clock isn't just ticking toward our judgment, it's ticking toward the final judgment, the last evaluation of whether conscious beings can ever fulfill their intended purpose or whether the entire concept was a mistake that needs to be permanently corrected. And we may be the ones who determine which way that evaluation goes, not just for ourselves, but for the future of consciousness throughout all of creation. The responsibility is ours. The choice is ours. The time is running out, and the consequences of choosing wrongly extend far beyond anything we previously imagined possible. Because this isn't just about forbidden history anymore. This is about whether there will be any history left to forbid. What if the answer lies not in some distant cosmic endgame, but in something far more immediate and terrifying? What if the signs we've been interpreting as warnings about future judgment are actually echoes from destructions that have already begun? What if the forbidden history we've been uncovering isn't just about ancient worlds that fell millennia ago, but about parallel realities collapsing around us right now? Because here's what the ancient texts don't tell you explicitly, but what becomes clear when you trace the patterns across multiple dimensions of reality. The destruction of pre-Adamic worlds wasn't a sequential process. It wasn't one civilization falling, then another beginning, then that one falling in turn. It was simultaneous. Multiple iterations of creation existing in parallel until divine judgment swept across all of them at once. And if that's true, if the cosmic reset we've been discussing operates across multiple layers of reality simultaneously, then we need to ask a question that will fundamentally alter your understanding of what's happening right now. What if our world isn't approaching judgment? What if our world is currently undergoing judgment and we're just experiencing it from inside the process? Think about the acceleration we've been witnessing, not just technological advancement, but the compression of time itself. Events that should take decades to unfold are happening in months. Changes that should require generations are occurring within single lifetimes. The pace of everything has shifted into patterns that don't follow natural progression curves. What if this acceleration isn't progress? What if it's collapse? What if we're experiencing the same time distortion that occurs when reality itself begins to break down under the weight of divine intervention? Ancient accounts of previous destructions don't describe gradual decline followed by sudden catastrophe. They describe periods of intense acceleration where everything speeds up beyond sustainable levels, where cause and effect begin to blur, where the normal rules governing progression of events start to malfunction. Sound familiar? Because that's exactly what we're experiencing right now. Time feels different than it did even a decade ago. Events cascade into each other with impossible speed. The gap between thought and manifestation, between decision and consequence, between cause and effect, has compressed to almost nothing. We interpret this as technological connectivity, as information overload, as the natural result of living in a hyperlinked digital age. But what if it's something far more fundamental? What if it's evidence that the fabric of our reality is beginning to unravel in preparation for a cosmic reset? Look at the synchronicities, the way current events seem to follow scripts written by forces that understand the patterns, because they've orchestrated them before. The way political movements, social upheavals, technological breakthroughs, and cultural shifts all seem to be converging toward the same inevitable conclusion. This isn't human planning. This isn't the result of conspiracy or coordination among earthly powers. This is a signature of influences that operate outside normal temporal constraints that can guide events across multiple timelines simultaneously, that understand the mechanics of reality breakdown, because they've witnessed it countless times before. And here's what makes this realization so terrifying. If we're already inside the judgment process, if the reset has already begun, then the choices we make now don't just affect our future. They determine which version of reality we experience as this iteration of creation collapses and transforms into whatever comes next. Because the ancient text suggests something that modern theology rarely discusses. Divine judgment isn't uniform. It's selective. Some consciousness survives the transition between worlds. Some awareness persists through the cosmic reset. Some intelligence carries forward into the next iteration with memory intact. But survival isn't automatic. It's earned through choices made during the collapse phase, through decisions that demonstrate worthiness to continue existing when everything around you dissolves back into primordial chaos. And those choices aren't what you might expect. They're not about moral perfection or religious orthodoxy or following specific behavioral codes. They're about recognition, about acknowledging the true nature of what's happening, about seeing through the illusion of permanence that keeps most consciousness trapped in patterns that lead to termination rather than transcendence. This is why the knowledge has been hidden, why forbidden history has been suppressed, why religious institutions avoid these discussions despite having access to the same ancient sources we've been exploring. Because once you understand what's really happening, once you grasp the true scope of the transformation process, everything changes. Your priorities shift. Your attachments loosen. Your fear of death transforms into something else entirely, because you realize death itself is just another illusion designed to keep consciousness locked into temporary forms rather than recognizing its eternal nature. But here's the catch. This recognition can't be forced. It can't be taught through intellectual understanding alone. It has to be experienced. It has to emerge from direct contact with the forces that govern cosmic transformation. It has to arise from willingness to let go of everything you think you know about the nature of reality itself. And most consciousness isn't capable of that surrender. Most intelligence clings to familiar patterns, even when those patterns are demonstrably leading toward dissolution. Most awareness chooses comfortable illusions over uncomfortable truths, even when those truths offer the only path to genuine continuity. This is why the pattern repeats. This is why world after world follows the same trajectory toward the same endpoint. Not because conscious beings are inherently evil, but because they're inherently attached to forms and structures and identities that are temporary by design. The cosmic reset isn't punishment. It's renovation. It's the universe's way of clearing out consciousness that has become too attached to temporary manifestations to recognize its own eternal nature. It's a filtering process that allows only the most adaptable, the most surrendered, the most willing to transcend form to continue existing in the next iteration. But this filtering isn't arbitrary. It's not based on moral worthiness or spiritual achievement or adherence to particular belief systems. It's based on recognition, on the ability to see what's really happening beneath the surface drama of civilizational collapse and technological acceleration and social upheaval. Can you recognize that your identity is not your body? Can you acknowledge that your consciousness is not dependent on the survival of your current form? Can you accept that everything you've built, everything you've achieved, everything you've accumulated in this Lifetime is ultimately temporary scaffolding designed to support your growth towards something more permanent. These aren't philosophical questions. These aren't abstract spiritual concepts. These are practical survival skills for navigating the transition between iterations of cosmic creation, and the window for developing these capabilities is closing faster than most people realize, because the acceleration isn't just affecting technology and politics and social structures. It's affecting consciousness itself. The compression of time is forcing awareness to evolve at unprecedented speeds. The breakdown of familiar patterns is creating opportunities for transcendence that might not appear again for cosmic ages. We're living through a moment of unprecedented possibility disguised as unprecedented crisis. A time when the normal rules governing the development of consciousness have been temporarily suspended to allow for quantum leaps that would normally require millions of years to achieve. But these opportunities don't wait for those who aren't ready to recognize them. They don't slow down for consciousness that remains attached to dying forms. They flow toward awareness that has already begun the process of letting go of surrendering temporary identities in service of permanent recognition. This is a real test, not whether humanity can avoid the fate of previous civilizations, but whether individual consciousness can transcend the limitations that keep it trapped in cycles of creation and destruction. Whether awareness can recognize its true nature before the current iteration dissolves completely. And that recognition has to happen now, not someday when conditions are more favorable. Not after you've achieved whatever goals you think you need to accomplish first. Now, in the midst of apparent chaos, while the familiar world dissolves around you and the new world struggles to emerge, because the bridge between iterations only remains open for a brief period. The window for conscious transition only stays available while both realities exist simultaneously. Once the old world completes its dissolution, once the new world stabilizes in its own patterns, the opportunity for voluntary evolution disappears until the next cosmic cycle begins. We're living in that window right now, experiencing the overlap period where multiple layers of reality coexist and consciousness has the chance to choose which layer it will inhabit going forward. But the choice has to be made consciously. It has to be made with full understanding of what's being offered and what's being released. And it has to be made while there's still time to make it effectively. Because the forbidden history we've been exploring isn't just about the past. It's about the present moment. It's about recognizing that you're living through the same type of transition that has occurred countless times before, but with an awareness that previous generations didn't possess. You have access to the complete picture. You can see the patterns. You understand the process. You know what's required for conscious survival of cosmic reset. The question is whether you have the courage to act on that knowledge, whether you can let go of attachments to temporary forms and identities, whether you can surrender the illusion of permanence that keeps most consciousness trapped in cycles that lead nowhere but back to the beginning, because this is your moment, your chance to break free from patterns that have dominated cosmic history since consciousness first emerged from primordial void, your opportunity to demonstrate that intelligence can transcend its own limitations and achieve the purpose for which it was originally created. But the window is closing. The acceleration is reaching critical mass. The transformation process is approaching the point where conscious participation becomes impossible because the forces involved exceed the capacity of individual awareness to navigate them effectively. If you're going to make the leap, if you're going to choose transcendence over repetition, evolution over dissolution, conscious survival over unconscious recycling, it has to happen now, not when you feel more prepared, not when circumstances seem more favorable, not when you've completed whatever you think you need to complete first. Now, while the bridge between worlds remains accessible, while the choice remains available, while consciousness still has the power to determine its own trajectory through the cosmic transformation that's already underway. Because forbidden history isn't just about what happened to those who came before us. It's about what's happening to us right now. And what happens next depends entirely on whether we can recognize the opportunity hidden within apparent catastrophe and choose transcendence while transcendence remains possible. The story isn't ending. It's transforming. And you get to decide which version of the story you'll be part of when the transformation completes itself. But you have to decide now, while decision still matters, while choice still shapes outcome, while consciousness still has the power to write its own destiny rather than simply experience. Whatever destiny gets written for it, this is the moment everything has been building toward. The culmination of forbidden history and the beginning of whatever comes next. The question is, are you ready to step through the door that's opening? Or will you remain attached to the room that's already beginning to dissolve? Because ready or not, the transformation is happening. The only choice that remains is whether you'll participate consciously or experience it unconsciously. And that choice will determine not just what happens to you, but what you become in reality that's emerging from the ashes of everything you once thought was permanent. The forbidden history ends here. Your real history begins now.